Hey, so today I'm going to show you guys how you can create the illusion of form by using patterns. Now, usually when we try to make something look three-dimensional, we add value. We add shadows, we add highlights to give the illusion that something has volume. Now, that's a great way to create implied form. However, you can also do it through pattern. So let's start off by talking about transferring something that's flat, like this grid that we see here, to the idea of a sphere. Now, right now this just looks like a circle, just a two-dimensional flat shape, but we want to try to make this look like a 3D sphere by putting a grid pattern over top of it. Now, think of a time that you've seen a globe, like something that shows the Earth and it's got the grid over top of it. Another example is if we take this ball, right? So from what we're seeing right here, this has a line that goes across it. It goes across the midsection. Now, the line looks pretty straight and flat right now, like this line that we see right here. However, if you were to rotate it, notice how that line, it starts to look curved. It doesn't just look like a regular flat line anymore, it looks a little bit curvy. But if you bring it back to center, that line just looks like a straight, flat line again. Now if we turn it this way, again it starts to curve, it starts to look a little bit curved from where it started. So now you're getting sort of like this parenthesis shape. So when something is directly facing you, it tends to just look like a flat shape, but then as you turn it and rotate it, it starts to look rounded. So when we come up here on our circle, we could start by just doing the straight line that comes across. So right now when we look at the sphere, the line is directly facing us, it looks flat. So you might just start by putting just a line down the center. Same with the line that goes horizontally across. If we hold this sphere with the line directly facing us, it just looks like a flat line. It's not really curving in any way. Now, what's going to change is if we start to move the sphere. So if we move it, block that light for you so you can see it. If you turn it this way, the sphere, like the line on the sphere, starts to look a little bit curved. So you want to take that idea and transfer it onto here where your line is a little bit curvy. Going to end up looking kind of like a basketball here. And the further away that line gets from center, the more curved it's going to look until eventually you can't see that line anymore. The closer it gets to you, the less curved and the more flat that it appears. So this is just a building block concept for when we tackle our patterns. You'll be able to see how this all works. So same thing when we go this way. The line looks slightly curved, moving away from us here, and then it looks very curved as the line moves even further away. Now I'm going to come back in here and darken this with a pen in a second, but let's go this way first. So our line is flat, but as it moves away, it looks a little bit curved. And then as it moves even further away, you're going to even see less of it. So then if we were to just darken this up with pen so that you can see it a little bit easier, we've got the line that comes in the front. So these lines right now are like perfectly parallel to our eyes, so they just look flat. But as you move away, those lines curve and conform to the contours of the object. And in this case it's a sphere, so they wrap perfectly around the sides. Same way this way. And then this side would look just like this. So let's say then that we wanted to create this pattern, for example. Well, this is just very similar to what this looks like. So you would start by doing the same idea. You have these flat lines that face us. You have these lines that curve around the sides. And then towards the top. And then the bottom. Okay. Now, the only difference between this pattern and this pattern is that this has these little lines that go across. Now, remember that we want our sphere to look like it's three-dimensional. So keep in mind that these lines that you draw, they might not just be perfectly flat lines. They might be slightly curvy because they are curving around the side of the sphere. And they're going to get smaller and less distinct the further away that you go. So this is probably the easiest example of all of our patterns. So notice how, without even adding shading, it looks like our sphere here is 3D because we've added these contour lines that wrap around the form or the implied form. Finish up with this side. So that's a really quick example of how you would do a pattern that's got sort of a grid effect to it. Now, how about on the other end? So over here, we've got dots. We've got polka dots. Now, this might seem sort of like, well, this isn't a grid. How do I exactly go about making this look like it's rounded? Well, one example I like to use is the human eye. So when the eye is looking directly at you, the iris and the pupil look flat. They look like perfect circles because they're directly facing us. Remember, anything that's parallel with us is going to look like a flat 2D shape. However, when the eye starts to move, notice that that circle starts to get a little bit more like an oval. It's getting kind of squished down off to the side until it's just sort of wrapping around the bottom of the sphere. Now, we bring it back to center, and it looks like a perfect flat circle. Now, how about when we turn it this way? Again, it's the same thing. No matter where you turn that eye, it's going to look less and less like a circle and more like an oval when it's going around the side of a sphere, and eventually you won't even be able to see it anymore. So let's start with the simplest thing. When the circle area is facing us, it just looks like a regular circle. Okay, so this is flat. Now, when we tilt it a little bit, notice how now it looks sort of like a squished oval off to the side. So you wouldn't really do a circle here, you would do an oval form. Same thing if the eye is pointing down this way. Sort of like that. And then when it's like really pointing downwards, notice how little you can see of that. So you're working with ovals. And the closer something is to facing you, it looks more like a circle, but as it moves away, it looks a little bit more flat. So you can just imagine that the closer something, for this example here, a circle gets to the side, it's going to look less like a circle and more like an oval. So see how now it looks like that pattern is sort of wrapping around the form, because as something gets far away from you, for example the eye and the iris here, as it moves away, it's a little bit more condensed on the side. So let's use the example here of our eyeball pattern. So right now, because this is a flat pattern, all the eyes are perfectly facing us, just like the iris is when it's directly looking at us. But then when something turns around the side, it's going to be a little bit more squished. So let's start with a few circles that are facing us directly. We'll do 3 here. So these are nice, perfect, flat circles. But then as we move over to the side, it's going to look a little bit more flat against the edges. So just keep in mind that the closer that you get to the edge of your sphere, the more squished and oval-like and condensed those circles are going to become. Or whatever shape you're creating, they're just going to get a little thinner, because as something gets further away from you, it looks smaller. And it's all about creating the illusion here. It doesn't necessarily have to be perfect, especially when you're just learning like we are now. You just want to create the illusion that it's got this roundness to it. And then from there, you can just add in your pattern, keeping in mind that if something is more oval, you should make the inside circles more oval too. And you would just go about filling it in that way. Now, what if we have a pattern that is, let's move on to this one next. So this one's got a series of lines, and they're kind of squiggly, okay? And then we've got these dots here. Well, this is actually pretty good, because we can use the same example that we used up here for the kind of globe-like sphere. You've got these lines, okay? I want you to think of these lines as this flat one that faces us. It's going to come straight down across the front, and then these lines don't cross over each other like these lines do, so we just have to worry about vertical lines for right now. So when we look at our sphere here, it looks pretty flat against us, and if this is what the flat pattern looks like, we can start by just doing one little wiggly line going across the front. Now, keep in mind that when we turn our sphere, that line looks a little bit more curved off to the side. So curve the line, but still make it wiggly, because that's how our flat pattern looks here. Tilting our line more, wiggling it even more around the side. Now let's go this way. The line is slightly curved, and then even more, just like so. And then you can go in there and add your circles. Now keep in mind, this is like the eyeball here. When the circle is directly facing us, it looks like a perfect circle. But then as we move over to the side, those circles are going to look a little bit more like ovals. They're going to get really thin and skinny. So these ones are slightly away from us, so they're going to be a little bit more like ovals. And then these ones are really thin. Just like so. Okay. So what if we have a pattern that is really free-flowing like this? It's kind of hard to figure out, what do I do with this? Well, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that the further something is away from you, the smaller and more compact it's going to get. So if this is our flat pattern, notice this line that comes across the center. It's pretty much the same width all the way across the square. I'm talking about this really thin white line that goes through the pattern. So if we were to just put that right on here, it might just look too flat. So instead, knowing that things look smaller as they get further away from us, we're going to do the same thing starting with this white line that comes across. So it's going to start out really skinny on the edges, and then it's going to get wider as it comes across the center. So notice how it seems like it's thinner, it's smaller as it gets further away, but then it gets wider as it gets closer. Same thing with the pattern that's on the inside of it. We've got these sort of circle formations, but those circles are going to start to look a little bit more like ovals and get narrower as they get further away. So they start out really round up here, and then they start to get a little bit skinnier as they move away from us. Okay. This one's a little bit more complicated, but if you apply the same ideas as you did for these, eventually you can kind of figure out how would this look if it was further away. Now, let's do something like this with the leaves. This is a very organic pattern, but if you can figure out where it can be a little bit more geometric, you can sort of figure out where you can go with this. So what I'm noticing is that this pattern has these lines, these vertical lines that cut through it. So I'm going to do the same principle as I did here. You have a vertical line that comes right across the front, just like it does with our sphere here, but then as it turns, it's going to look a little bit more rounded. So this is just my building block for figuring this pattern out. And then from here, I'm going to start with the center. It looks like these leaf shapes sort of come up like that, and then they go out and back in, and then they come up the sides like so. So that's like one leaf pattern. Just to show you what it might look like once you finish filling it all out. Okay, so we've got that. Now we know that on the sides, it's going to look a little bit warped, but as long as you stay within those guidelines that you drew for yourself here, it's going to kind of sort itself out a little bit. Try not to just make things up. Really try to stay in these guidelines that you're creating for yourself, these lines I did that came across the front. I'm trying to make sure that things stay symmetrical for the most part. Trying to just make sure it all makes sense. Just like so. It takes some practice, but once you can kind of figure out like the idea of how would this look as a 3D thing, how would it look if it was wrapping around the form? And you've got to be able to understand how ovals tend to look a little bit narrower as they get further away, as they tilt away from us. How lines curve away. That's why it's good to look at something like an eyeball or a globe. Just have things wrap around. So that's how I would go about doing that one in a very quick way. So we have one more here, and that's this sort of little mountain kind of pattern that we have. Now this one's a little bit different because instead of having lines that go, the obvious lines at least, that go straight vertical and straight horizontal, you kind of notice that there's this kind of diagonal thing going on. Well, it's actually easier to figure out than you might think it is. So we notice that there's this sort of X going across here. If I were to kind of draw it out in a way where you can see it, you've got these lines that come across here. They're basically diagonal versions of this. So this is actually the same exact principle as this kind of globe grid sort of thing, but it's just going diagonal instead. So instead of starting with a perfect vertical and horizontal line, you're going diagonal this time. So we've got that, and again, the lines curve. So this is just like this first globe that we drew. It's just now tilted to the side. It's the same concept. Now it's just tilting a different direction. Okay. Now from here, we can figure out where our little patterns are. So this pattern sort of has these little kind of pointy triangle peaks that go this way. So now that you've got your grid figured out, you can just drop them in that way. And I'm doing this in a very quick way just for the sake of time for this demo. But once you've got like your grid figured out, you can really take your time and make sure that the pattern looks really nice. So you got it figured out that way. Notice how it really looks like it's wrapping around that form. And then from here, this is a very dark pattern. So just for the sake of making it look a little bit more complete, kind of fill in a few of these dark diamonds that we're seeing. So rather than just trying to freehand it and draw all these shapes individually, try to see if you can find a grid to start out with, like we see with our globe here, or if you can find circles in your design. And this one that we did down here is a little bit of both, because it had these lines that come vertically down, just like the grid does, but it also has circles. And remember that whenever you're looking at a circle straight on, it looks like a perfect circle. As it tilts away, it starts to look more and more like an oval. It gets skinnier and skinnier until it just disappears. Same concept, but just different format for something that has lines. If something is directly facing you with a line on it, the line will look very straight, but as it curves away, that line's going to look curvier as well. So as long as you keep those two basic fundamentals in mind, you can apply it to any pattern that you want.